Our topic is people on the move. And when we think of immigration and emigration, two different words, immigration, emigration, we think oftentimes in the modern era of individuals, families, maybe groups, neighbors, social organizations, something like that. There are times in history, however, when the people on the move were in the thousands and tens of thousands and hundreds of thousands. Entire nations on the move, and that word nation in the sense of ethnic groups. We're going to see that happening, which requires us to be conversant with some geography, names of places, and so forth. So, for example, the Hittites were the first people group to occupy the land we call Turkey. But at that point in time, it went by different names. It was known as Anatolia. It was known as Asia Minor. The western coast of Turkey was known as Ionia. And when we say the Hittites were the first, they weren't necessarily the first people to set foot on that land, but they were the first civilization on that land. And they developed their language, their writing, cuneiform writing, and Hittite was an Indo-European language. And in a minute, we're going to see what Indo-European means. We're going to see that religion and language and people on the move all hang together. So we're going to learn about the different languages and how different languages developed because large groups of people moved from place to place. And we're going to see religion playing a role in those movements because oftentimes those motions, those transportations from one place to another were in some way, shape, or form connected to religion. And we'll see that when the Hebrews, later known as Israelites, later known as Jews, move en masse from one place to another. And remember, Hebrew, Israelite, Jew are three different words referring to different developmental phases of that ethnic group. People move, and they move in large numbers throughout history. Sometimes we can mistakenly think that people are largely stationary in their various territories and city-states and nation-states, but in fact, there are, throughout history, large mass migrations. The most foundational of these are the so-called Indo-European migrations, named because they stretch from India to Europe. And you can see on the map here, the center, the Caucasus Mountains, northeast of the Black Sea, northwest of the Caspian, and from this central location, various groups moved east, west, north, and south. These groups shared a common language and culture originally, but as they moved farther from each other and as time elapsed, they developed their own variations and eventually their own entirely different and separate cultures and languages. Language in particular is going to be a focal point. Here you see a diagram of exactly what happened here. The original Indo-European language spoke in that region of the Caucasus Mountains eventually gave birth to children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren of various languages. And we can see that these languages, the modern ones which still exist, are quite different from each other. And yet it is true that Italian is related to Sanskrit and that Persian is related to French. All of these languages grew like a plant from the one original language. A separate language family was developing in another part of the globe, and the Semitic language family is also quite geographically and linguistically spread out. So modern-day Hebrew and Arabic, to anyone who's listened to them, will certainly appear related and sound related. The structures, vocabulary is quite similar, but there's also languages like the languages of Ethiopia and the languages of the Mesopotamian civilizations, Babylonia, Akkadian, etc., etc. So we see language developing from one parent language, one original language Indo-European or Proto-Semitic into a whole family of languages. Taken to an even bigger scale, we can see here that these two separate families, the Semitic family and the Indo-European family, are in turn part of a still larger family. And a language called Nostratic was an original parent language for almost every language known in history and on the planet Earth. So we can see there is a genetic relationship between languages, all languages on the planet, somehow descending from a common ancestor, one original human language. Turning from language to religion, we're going to look at religion as having a couple of features. One is written texts. For example, in Hinduism, Hinduism has three text bodies, three groups of texts which are foundational to Hindu belief. The practice of any religion is not something that the individual simply makes up out of thin air, but these are all written sources. Buddhism is a little bit more of a complicated example. The founder of Buddhism, Siddhartha, was an Indian, and he himself left to us no written texts. The earliest texts we have were the notes taken by the first several generations of his followers. So Buddhism likewise is a textual religion. When we think about Siddhartha and we think about Buddhism, we're going to run into a little bit of a paradox, a little bit of a cognitive tension. Cognitive dissonance is another word for that. We see a typical image of Buddha, and these are quite common. They are in small scale, only an inch or two tall, and they are in large scale, hundreds of feet tall, and everything in between. And yet there's something wrong with this image, even though it's familiar to millions of people around the world. Siddhartha, the original Buddha, was from India. And yet in art, he is routinely given the facial features of someone from East Asia. How did that come to be? Well, his philosophy, his religion, whatever you want to call it, became quite popular in Eastern Asia. And so eventually the artists began to remake the historical Siddhartha into their own image. Jainism, less well known perhaps than Buddhism and Hinduism, began in India also, and Jainism is an extremely pacifistic religion. Jainism sees a soul in every object, and so followers of the Jainist religion tend to be very hesitant to do anything that could harm this perceived soul. Moving from religion to civilization, the development of language spoken we talked about. Now we're going to talk about the development of written language. And the big step forward that we are going to see so many times is the move to alphabets. Now that may sound quite simple. We're used to writing with alphabets all the time, but the alphabet was actually a revolutionary invention. Prior to alphabets, there were things like hieroglyphs, cuneiform, pictograms, and moving from those to letters and alphabets changed the means of communication. It made it easier to learn reading and writing, which now you can do by the age of 5 or 10. Previously, with the much more complicated writing systems, it took much longer to learn to read and write. It also made it quicker to actually do the reading and writing. You can grab a pencil and write your shopping list in 30 seconds. Whereas with these older writing systems, that may have taken hours. Here's an example, of course, Egyptian, hieroglyphic. Each symbol had to be interpreted carefully. What did it mean? How did it sound? And deciphering such documents was time-consuming. Again, speed is the cue for alphabets. alphabets were just one of several big advancements. We see the move to monotheism, we see the move to monogamy, and we see the ending of the practice of human sacrifice, along with the development of alphabets. So we're going to see those as four key milestones in civilization. The western edge of the Mediterranean is a complicated place. There's a bunch of different cultures, societies, civilizations, all bumping into each other there. We have the Phoenicians, we have the Philistines, we have the Canaanites, we have the Hebrews, all making claims and counterclaims to the same piece of land, and the exact definition of those national names, those ethnic names, will change from century to century. Canaan was originally defined as between the Mediterranean and the Jordan River, that strip of land, but we'll see it expand and contract with different movements. We're going to see eventually that area does become Israel after a long and tortuous set of migrations by the Hebrews to and from other areas. That Jordan River Valley area was ultimately the destination of Abraham when he left Ur, when he left behind a civilization and adopted, instead of a house, he adopted the nomadic lifestyle, eventually wound up in the Jordan River Valley area. And from that point on, the land becomes increasingly identified with the Hebrews generation after generation. At first, there's a lot of competition with the Canaanites and Philistines, but eventually it becomes identified with the Hebrews. Abraham lived there around 2000 BC, give or take a century, who knows. We're going to see that Abraham is living in that area. Won't say he settled in that area because he retained a nomadic lifestyle, but he lives in that area, his children, his grandchildren, and eventually Abraham is gone, he's dead and buried, and his descendants will move in a large group to Egypt. And that's going to have some long-run consequences. That move to Egypt, then maybe a century or two after Abraham. Again, we're playing fast and loose with the dates. This is a map of the ancient Near East, and the features worth noting are, of course, the Tigris and Euphrates and the land between them, Mesopotamia, home to a number of early civilizations. Mesopotamia is one half of the Fertile Crescent. The Fertile Crescent is exactly that. It's land which is fertile, it's good for farming, so it meant there was a steady food supply, and that's where people could begin to build towns and cities. So Mesopotamia runs northwest from the Persian Gulf up to the city of Haran, and then from Haran it runs southwest to the Sinai Peninsula area. So it's called the Fertile Crescent. It's a little bit of imagination to call it a crescent. You might call it an acute angle, but that general shape is the Fertile Crescent. And that Fertile Crescent turns out to be very much the route taken by Abraham. Around 2000 BC, give or take, he left the city of Ur and marched up the river valley to Haran, and from there took the other leg of the Fertile Crescent southwest to the area of Jerusalem. Jerusalem at that time was still called simply Salem. It had not yet been named Jerusalem. When we say marched, of course, Abraham was not a military man most of the time. He was simply a landowner who sold his land and became a nomad and traveled with his wife, a number of family members, and a few servants. You can imagine camels and donkeys with burdens on their back as they went from place to place. But this is the route of Abraham. You notice there is a little bit of a side trip too from the southern and the southwestern end of the Fertile Crescent to Egypt and back, which is an incident recorded in the documents of Abraham's life. Also on the move, We see the wanderings of Abraham's descendants about 400, 500 years after the time of Abraham. His children, grandchildren, great-grandchildren, etc., had developed into a very large ethnic group in Egypt, and they are going to leave Egypt and take a meandering route to the area around the eastern end of the Mediterranean, the area north of the Dead Sea, around what would become Jerusalem, around what would become Israel. And jumping forward in history yet again by hundreds of years, those descendants of Abraham who had settled in the area of what is now officially Jerusalem and Israel are going to find themselves taken captives, and you can see the routes here. A series of military maneuvers by Assyria and Babylonia are going to crush the Israelite kingdoms, and they will be deported and held captive for a number of years. Eventually, the southern half, or rather the residents of the southern half of Israel, will return and restart their own country. The Hebrews, these descendants of Abraham, developed their own culture and defined themselves in contrast to the Egyptians, in contrast to the Canaanites, Philistines, Phoenicians, etc., etc. Part of their identification, self-identification, was their belief in an agreement, a contract, a covenant with God. And they believed that their deal with God was part of this concept of ethical monotheism, the relationship between religion and ethics, as opposed to the other competing religions of the area, which had no ethical dimension. They were simply based on trying to manipulate a deity to give you good weather and military victory. The Hebrews bound ethics to religion and did so in an interesting way. They did not believe that they earned God's favor by being good. In fact, it was the very opposite. They thought that because they had God's favor, they would, in response, be good. So it's never a case of earning the favor of the deity. That would have been exactly what the competing cultures were doing. Instead, they received the favor of the deity and responded with ethical lifestyles. The Hebrews had been slaves in Egypt, and they escaped from slavery, moving out of Egypt. And this also makes an imprint on their thought patterns. It is a liberation-oriented idea, culture, worldview that the Hebrews have, and they're going to be advocating for the elimination of slavery in the long run. So we can see in the laws of Moses limitation after limitation after limitation being put on the practice of slavery, with the eventual goal of eliminating it altogether. The Hebrews were organized into 12 tribes, as they were called. Coming out of Egypt, there were 12 tribes, and for the first 400 years or so after their escape from Egypt, they will operate as a tribal confederation. That's the name for their form of government, a tribal confederation. Eventually, that's going to give way to the monarchy. But this political system, again, should never be confused with their moral, ethical, and religious systems. The strict ethical demands of God were tempered by mercy, grace, and forgiveness. So the Hebrew system had a softer feel to it than for example, the laws of Hammurabi, which were quite strict and unyielding. In a previous unit, we discussed the Code of Hammurabi, early Babylonian king who issued a series of laws and had them written and codified, and the importance of a written, publicly available law code is that it forms the rule of law. It makes it objective. It can be fairly applied, objectively, impartially applied. So Hammurabi is a milestone in the development of civilization. Moses will be the next step forward. Moses is going to come up with some improvements on the idea of a legal law code. So we're going to see how Moses represents the next step beyond Hammurabi. Moses moves into monotheism. Hammurabi's polytheism left him with a less certain moral code, and polytheism is linked to specifically things like human sacrifice. And so Moses will move into monotheism. Moses sees religion as a relationship, and this is going to affect the idea of a ethical monotheism. Hammurabi saw religion as a way to manipulate the gods into giving you good farmland or military success. And so there was no ethical dimension to Hammurabi's religious or proto-religious phase. Moses approached the legal code from an ethical standpoint. What is it that you should do? Hammurabi simply saw legal codes as instructions and penalties for their violations. This leads to questions about motivation and leads to questions about the objectivity of law. Moses was proactive rather than simply issuing punishments to criminals. He hoped to avoid criminal activity, to offer motivations to do something else. Moses led to standards of evidence. Eyewitnesses are required for convictions. In Hammurabi's code, an accusation sometimes sufficed for a conviction. Moses' law code was established with a purpose of forming a society, of taking a bunch of ragtag escaped slaves who had no leadership experience and helping them to create a civilization. Hammurabi's code was given to an already existing civilization for the purpose of keeping things the way they are. In Moses' system, the envisioned is the possibility of change. One can go from being a slave to being a free person. In Hammurabi's system, static social positions are expected and indeed seen as desirable. There is no social mobility. Moses was sparing in his use of capital punishment only for crimes against persons. Those crimes are generally understood to be murder, rape, kidnapping, and treason. Hammurabi, on the other hand, used capital punishment quite frequently, often for crimes against property rather than crimes against persons. Moses was born in Egypt and eventually left it. Moses went from being a member of the aristocracy to being an outcast to eventually being a political leader. Again, Moses saw society as a place where change can take place. Hammurabi, a static society. He was born into the aristocracy and spent his entire life in aristocracy. Nothing changed for him, and he was happy with that. Gender issues. Moses gave increased legal status to women. Laws given by Moses are often given impartially to be applied to men and women in the same way. Hammurabi clearly relegated women to inferior status. Moses valued human life and placed it into a separate category from property. Hammurabi saw human life as interchangeable with economic value. In Hammurabi's code, you could murder a slave and make up for that by a cash payment. Hammurabi also lived in a society, a civilization in which human sacrifice was the norm and was not questioned. The legal system of Moses gives special privilege, special status to groups like the widows, the orphans, the poor, and the foreigners. Hammurabi, on the other hand, saw the usual suspects, legal privileges, special status was given to the wealthy, to the aristocracy, to the king and his dynasty. This is a sharp contrast between the world of Moses and the world of Hammurabi. The idea that society should voluntarily reach out to support those who are vulnerable. And if you look at Moses's 4 special categories, widows, orphans, the poor, and the foreigners, these are people who are vulnerable in society. And Moses creates an ethical obligation to watch out for those people, to help them. Hebrew culture found a limit to human reason. The idea that the human mind is not capable of solving every problem, of exploring every bit of reality, that there are limits to human reason. This is in some ways anticipating by 3,000 to 4,000 years the philosopher Immanuel Kant, but that's a discussion for a different day. By contrast, the Babylonian culture used myth as a vehicle to attempt explanations. When faced with an unanswerable question, the Hebrews simply said, "We don't know." The Babylonians proceeded to make up a story, usually involving lots of gods and goddesses and amazing, miraculous events. In the world of Moses, there is some connection between ethics and religion. It's not a direct, clear connection, but there is a connection between the two. In Hammurabi's world, the legal code was not ethical. It was not a question of what's morally right and morally wrong. It's simply the laws or whatever the king says they are. And the legal code in Hammurabi's world was not related to religion either. It was simply the will of the king, objectively codified so that it could be enforced without bias or partiality, but it was still merely the king's will. In Hammurabi's legal code, there were allusions to God, goddesses, deities, idols, whatever you want to call them, mainly in the form of art, that the stones on which the legal code were carved had images of gods, but these were not intrinsic or inherent in the legal code, but essentially external decorations. In terms of time, Moses is maybe 250 years after Hammurabi, give or take a century either way. Moses looked at a psychological view of the human being. What are motives? What is guilt? Guilt is an internal matter when the individual knows that he has indeed violated a law. And the question of intent, violation of a law, was not something that happened by accident. It required the will to violate the law. So if accidentally one caused the death of another human being, that was not considered the legal equivalent of murder. Hammurabi gave no consideration of motive whatsoever, and guilt was also not a concept that was part of Hammurabi's law. Shame replaced guilt, or we should say shame was there before guilt in Hammurabi's world. Shame is not an inner concept for the individual, but rather a societal concept, an external shaming by other members of society. The sense of time among the Hebrews was linear, which allows for change in the individual, for society, for civilization along a timeline, whereas the Babylonians in Hammurabi's world saw time as circular and therefore, essentially, there would be no progress. Moses saw slavery as something which needed to be gradually reduced and eventually eliminated. And slaves were still considered to be humans legally and had rights. A slave could, in fact, allege a crime against his master, and the master could be tried legally for a crime against his slave. Whereas in Hammurabi's world, slaves were property, owners could kill them, beat them, and that was seen as a property right. When the Hebrews develop finally the monarchy after the 400 years of tribal confederation, their first king is going to be Saul. The next king is David. David is the one who makes Jerusalem the capital city of Israel. Jerusalem is not a major focal point prior to the time of David. After David, his son Solomon will take the throne, and that is the brief life of the united Israel monarchy. Just 3 kings, Saul, David, Solomon. After Solomon's reign, there's going to be a civil war. The civil war was brought about by the result of Solomon's very aggressive taxation policies. Solomon taxed the people mercilessly, taxing them either by requiring gold and silver, cash in other words, or by requiring payment in kind, wood, food, metal, some product, or forced labor. And forced labor is just a nice word for slavery, which turns out to be a kind of taxation. The people were required to donate a certain amount of labor to the king. They had enough of it, and when Solomon dies, his son wants to take over the throne of a united Israel, but the people rebel, and there's a civil war. And after that civil war, the Israel kingdom will be divided north and south. And that's going to drag on for a century or two afterwards. But the actual time of the united Israel kingdom was very short indeed. We're going to see that these 2 kingdoms each come to an end, the northern and the southern kingdom. The results of that civil war, the northern kingdom is going to be conquered by the Assyrians, taken into captivity, and it's basically going to disappear in the mists of history. It kind of fades away and nothing is heard of it again. The southern kingdom will be captured by the Babylonians under the leadership of the guy with a funny name, Nebuchadnezzar. Nebuchadnezzar will take the Israelites captive, or the Israelites from the southern half of the kingdom known as Judah. He's going to take those people from the southern kingdom captive and take them to Babylonia, the city of Babylon and the Babylonian kingdom that surrounds it. They will live there for 70 years as POWs, prisoners of war, essentially as slaves or servants. During that time, the culture of these people from the southern kingdom is going to undertake quite a change. They are going to sharpen and refine their religious and spiritual views. The Hebrew texts are going to come into focus. The first 5 books, they are called the books of Moses, which is different than the books by Moses. They're the books of Moses, called either the Torah or the Pentateuch, are going to become central, but there will also be other writings. You're going to hear of prophets like Ezekiel who tell the captives, hang in there, you're going to be captives for 70 years, but then you'll get your freedom back. And sure enough, they do. When the Persian king Cyrus attacks Babylon, in the fall of the Babylonian Empire to Cyrus the Persian, the groups which had been held captive by the Babylonians, including the people from the southern kingdom, the southern half of Israel, they will be set free. The Babylonian Empire has fallen, and the former captives are free to return to their homes. And that is a lot of wandering if you trace it back over a map, and that's why this unit is called People on the Move.